Hello friends, welcome to the video series on interview question for SQL PL SQL developers. So this video is a continuation of the part 1 video of constraint related interview question. So in the part 1 video we have seen about what is data integrity, what is constraint and what are all the types of constraint. As a continuation of that, in this video we are going to see about what is not null constraint and how to define and how to use this not null constraint. So in the previous video I have showed you about the types of constraint like not null constraint, unique constraint, primary key constraint, foreign key, check and reference constraint. So in this video we'll see specifically about not null constraint, and in the subsequent video of this series we'll see about the rest of the constraints. Let's start with the not null constraint. So basically we are going to see about what is not null constraint, how to define a not null constraint, and once a constraint is defined, where to go and check the metadata information related to the constraint, and how to enable or disable a constraint, and finally how to drop an existing constraint. Fine. Let's understand what is a not null constraint. As the keyword says, by specifying the not null constraint or by creating a not null constraint, we are actually prohibiting the null value getting inserted or updated into a table. Many cases we want a column to have a not null value. For example, an employee name must not be null. An employee ID must not be null. In case of a banking accounting system, everyone should have an account. So the account number is kind of a not null value. Of course, it is like a primary key or a unique value, but it should not be null. Basically, a not null constraint can be defined wherever a column must have a defined. So basically, the not null constraint prohibits the column from containing null value. Okay, let's see how to define the not null constraint. We just need to say the not null keyword using the inline specification. So what I mean by inline specification here is that we need to specify this not null keyword as part of the column definition. When we are trying to create the table creation script, as part of the column definition, you just need to go and specify this not null keyword. If you are not specifying this not null keyword, the default behavior is null. That means the null values will be allowed to get inserted or updated in a column. Even if you are not specifying anything, the default is null. But if you want, we can explicitly specify the null keyword also. But whether we are specifying the null or not, the default behavior is null. We'll see an example by specifying the null and the not null keyword. Fine. So now let's see how to define a not null constraint. So basically now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a table called employee with 5 columns like employee number, e-name, address 1, address 2, address 3. Suppose I feel that every employee must have at least address 1. So I can just go and say this not null keyword as part of this column definition. If you are not specifying this not null keyword, the default behavior is null. But if you want a not null constraint to be defined, you can just go and specify that not null keyword here. So let me just try to create the table. So now what will happen, as part of this table creation, a constraint will get automatically created on this address 1 column. How can I check where the constraint is defined or what is the name of the constraint? You can go and check a table called user underscore constraint. So basically this is the data dictionary table. Just go and check the user underscore constraint table, filter for this table name, where table name equal to, let's say, filter for employee table. Now you can see that a constraint got created. So by default, when you are not specifying any constraint name, because specifying a constraint name is optional. If you are not specifying any constraint name, Oracle by default will create the constraint with a system defined constraint name. So this would be the format like sys underscore c followed by some number. So Oracle by default will give a name for your constraint. If you want, you can go and define a name for your constraint as part of the definition itself. So let's just try to drop this table and just try to recreate the table by specifying the constraint. This is optional, but I would always suggest to create a constraint with a user defined name. So let us give a name for this constraint now. So for that we need to say constraint. So constraint is the keyword followed by, you just need to give a name for this. Let's say that address not null constraint. So this is the name I'm giving. So the naming convention should follow the naming convention of any object in the database. Okay, so I'm just trying to recreate the table now that I have created the table. Now if you go and check the user constraints data dictionary table, you'll be able to see the constraint name here, like whatever the constraint name you have defined here, that name you should be able to see here. See, there is a reason to give this name also, because only when you know the name of the constraint, it would be very helpful for you to go and enable or disable the constraint, or even to drop that constraint based on the name. Because if you don't know the name, then it is not possible to enable, disable or drop. For that, we need to go and check the user constraint, then get the name of the constraint and use that name. That's why it is always better to give a user defined name so that it is easy. Second thing is that since we are going to give a user defined name, we can follow a naming convention for all our like table, constraints, everything. Fine. So let me just show you one more thing. So let me just drop it. Let me just make address to as a not null. So in this case, I am not giving any user defined constraint. So let me just recreate the table. So now if you see, we have actually created two constraints. One not null constraint on address 1 column with user defined name as like address not null cons, and in the second column, that is in the address 2 column, we just created a not null constraint, but we have not given any user defined name. So in that case, what Oracle will do, as I mentioned, one constraint will get created with user defined name. The second constraint on the address 2 column will get created with a system defined constraint name. Fine. Now that we have defined two not null constraints, one on address 1 column and one on address 2 column. So if you're trying to insert a null value for address 1 and address 2, obviously it will throw an error. So let's just try to insert null value for both address 1 and address 2. So obviously we'll get an error saying that cannot insert null into address 1. So let us try to give some valid value for address 1 column. Let me say Delhi. So now you will see another error called cannot insert null into address 2, because we defined one more not null constraint on address 2 column. So let me just make this as a not null value. Let me say MJ road. So now let me just try to insert a valid value. Now you can see once we given a valid value, that is other than null value for both address 1 and address 2 column, we are able to insert. In fact, this is the main purpose of defining a constraint on a column. So here is the syntax. As I mentioned, you can either specify the constraint keyword or constraint name like that, but this is like optional. Okay, it's not mandatory like you have to give the constraint and a name. If you are not giving this, Oracle will automatically define a name for your constraint. Okay, one more very important point I just want to tell you. I told you that we can even give a null value as part of this. If you're not specifying anything here, the default is null. That means the column can have a null value. Let me just show you that. I'm just dropping. Okay, it's already dropped. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to say null here. Okay, now I'm just going to create the table. Now you see this, even if you're not specifying, or you can go and explicitly specify this. Okay. So this is the default behavior. Either you can go and explicitly specify null value here, or you can just ignore, or you can leave it something like this, because the default behavior is Oracle will allow a null value, but this will not go and create any constraint here. Only for these two cases, Oracle will create constraint. Okay, so let's just see this. See, now you can see Oracle has created only two constraints, one not null constraint on address 1 column and another not null constraint on address 2 column. Okay. So now let's check where to check all the metadata information related to the constraint. So as I already mentioned, this is one of the very important data dictionary table to know the information about the constraint name. There is one more very important data dictionary table related to the constraint, that is user constraint columns. User cons columns. Okay, so basically what this will give you, the column on which the constraint is defined. So let me just filter for employee table. You can see here the constraint defined on which particular column. For example, in this case, we defined a not null constraint called address not null cons on address 1 column. So this is the definition. Similarly, we defined one more not null constraint on address 2 column. So in this case, we didn't specify any name. So there is a user defined constraint name here, sorry, system defined constraint name here on address 2 column. So these are the two important tables which we should always remember with respect to constraint. One is like user constraint and another is like user constraint columns table. Okay, now let's see how to enable or disable a constraint. Now that we have defined two constraints, let's see the status of this constraint. Okay, so by default, if you see, both these constraints would be in the status of enable. You can check in the user constraints table. So both these constraints are enabled. That means when a constraint is enabled, these rules will be enforced when we do an insert or update operation on the table. Suppose sometimes if you don't want the constraint to be enabled, or if you don't want the constraint to get fired, then what you can do, you can just go and disable it. So disabling is quite simple. You just say alter table employee disable constraint name. Okay, we just need to say constraint name. For example, I'm just trying to disable the constraint which is defined on the address 1 column. So now the table is altered. Now let us go and check the status of the constraint. Now you can see that the status is disabled for address 1. So this is the reason I told you it is better to give a user defined constraint name. Otherwise we need to get that constraint name from user constraint and then we need to use it here. Fine. So now just one more point I want to tell you. So this is the way we can go on the enable. Similarly, we can go on disable also. For example, enable also. Like let me just say enable. Now I'm re-enabling this constraint back. Let's say you can, now we re-enabled both the constraint. Okay, one more thing. While creating the table itself, if you want, we can create the constraint in a disabled mode also. By default, when you create a constraint, the constraints will be created in an enabled mode. If you want the constraints to be created in the disabled mode default, then you need to just go and say disable keyword. Okay, so now let me just recreate the table. The table is created. Now if you go and check the address 1 constraint, right, this should be created in the disabled mode because we mentioned the disable keyword. Okay, so here are the syntax to be remembered for enabling and disabling. The syntax is quite simple and straightforward. You say alter table name followed by either enable or disable keyword, constraint and constraint name. And finally, let's see how to drop a constraint. Suppose if we feel that this constraint is no more needed, so we just need to say alter table employee drop constraint name. That's it. So now let's see, we have actually created two constraints, but by this time since we have dropped one constraint, you will be able to see only one constraint on address 2 column. So here is the syntax for dropping the constraint. If you want any questions to be answered, you can post it in the comment section or you can drop to this mail ID. But before that, you can check whether a similar question has already been answered or posted as part of the subscriber question series or as part of the interview question series. If you're not able to find your question here, please write back to me. I'll be happy to record and post as a new video. If you have learned something new, please like this video, subscribe and stay tuned for new feature video, interview question, SQL practical question and concept videos. And thanks a lot for watching this video. Please click the bell icon if you want to receive instant notification whenever new videos are uploaded into this channel. Thank you.